I want to introduce my next guest. I know that this is so full today. This is rich. And so we are going to be sending the recording of this so you can go back and you can watch. But my friend Agnes, oh my goodness, Agnes, Starling Community, you're creating a community already. And a registered nurse, versed in adverse childhood experiences. I want to let you know I'm going to give you an extra few minutes because we went a little over time. So you get your full 15, but I just am so thankful that you're here. Everyone, welcome Agnes.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here, slightly nervous as I sit here at 7 months pregnant with 3 kids running around somewhere and about to share some messier parts of myself. So bear with me as we all do this together, being brave parents. So my name is Agnes, like I said, and I really, as a registered nurse, I work with individuals who struggle with mental illness and addiction, who often have huge financial struggles, and who often, very often have stories of trauma in their childhood. And we hear the question often, you know, why do I have these behaviors, these emotions? Where is this all coming from? So I, as a trauma-informed care advocate, I really try to grow our community understanding, you know, 2/3 of our population has experienced trauma. So we have to be able to look at people from a trauma-informed care lens. And I'll touch base on that. As a parent who grew up in a home where mental illness and addiction existed and the chaos that comes with that, I had no idea that my experiences and the emotions that come with them would impact my ability to parent in healthy ways. So today what I really want to do is I'm going to touch base on the statistics and the science that come with adverse childhood experiences. But I'm going to incorporate some of my own stories so that we can all be a little bit better at listening and understanding and supporting the stories that are unfolding right in front of us. And yes, when this pandemic's over, that mom and that child we think we have nothing in common with, I want to erase those lines in the sand. But for today, I really want us to be able to understand our own stories a little bit better so that we can support our kids a little bit better. So on that note, big breath, I want to ask everybody, how have the experiences in your childhood impacted the way you parent today? So how have those good experiences that brought those really good feelings of joy, of love, of happiness, and brought laughter, how have those experiences impacted the way you parent today? And have you thought about that? And if there's someone attached to that, maybe send them a thank you card later on. But on the flip side, how have the negative experiences that brought those negative emotions into your life? And this might be a bit of a trigger, and I apologize because I'm going to ask people to dig a little bit deeper. But how have those experiences that brought sadness, that brought shame, that brought fear and anger or rage, how have those experiences impacted the way you parent today? Now, if someone were to ask me, how did my childhood impact my childhood? I could very easily say, well, yeah, I cried lots on the washing floor, wishing huge chunks of it away. I couldn't wait to be an adult and a grown-up because that's when life gets really good. But if someone were to ask me how my childhood experiences would impact my parenting, I would have said it will not. And I quickly just want to take a time out because we've heard the word trauma a lot today and really great explanations. I just want to redefine it for a bunch of people and talk about the ACEs study. So 2 decades ago, there were 2 physicians who did the adverse childhood experiences study. So what they did was they asked 17,000 individuals if they had experienced any one of these 10 forms of adversity between the ages of 0 and 17. Childhood is 0 to 17. Keep that in mind as well. And so this included abuse, so physical, emotional, sexual neglect, emotional neglect, physical neglect, and household dysfunction. So living with a parent with mental illness, a parent who had a substance dependency, a parent who has been incarcerated, witnessing domestic violence, and losing a parent to divorce or death. Now, I'm going to take another little pause for just a second and say, you know, I could easily tick off 6 and 7 of these, easily. I never would have considered myself traumatized. I never would have thought that I experienced trauma. One, as a child, you don't have that vocabulary and you just don't see your life in that perspective, neither as a teenager or a young adult. And there was a lot of love in our family, but that doesn't disregard what we experienced. And often today, even as a registered nurse, I have conversations as an advocate where people say, no, people in Canada have choice, they have opportunity. Trauma doesn't happen here, it happens over there, an ocean away. This is not trauma. So I want to redefine that for all of us. That trauma is not what happens to you, because not everybody who experiences these forms of adversity are going to be traumatized. But trauma is what happens inside of us. And I didn't create that definition, but this is so important for us to redefine so we can understand ourselves and our children and other people better. Trauma is what happens to you because of what has happened. Trauma is what happens inside of you, because of what has happened to you. What happens inside of us, and we've heard already about that stress response system, but that child, that baby, that adolescent who is living in a home with a parent with a mental illness and addiction, who can't be emotionally present for their kids, that child who's witnessing domestic violence, or who has a parent who isn't there, who is experiencing physical or emotional neglect or abuse, their stress response system is kicked in and they're living in fear. And I know we've heard this, I'm just going to reiterate it. So that child in you was living in fear. So that stress response goes on and on and on. And usually a parent who is able to would come and hug you and love you and say you are safe and you belong. That would happen enough times and our brain would say, okay, cool. The world is a safe place. What happens when you don't have a parent who is able to, in that moment, because they're struggling with their own mental illness, they're struggling with their own childhood adversity, they're using alcohol or drugs as a way to cope, they aren't able to remain present for their kids. And so that stress response system goes into overdrive. And what becomes trauma is when that stress becomes toxic, it becomes overwhelming. And yes, it does happen to us in our homes. I never would have considered myself traumatized, but I had to accept that was what was happening in my body. All right, so now that we redefine that, how common is this? So what that study showed was that 2 in 3 people have experienced one or more. And if you had experienced one, you were 87% more likely to have experienced 2 or more. They don't happen in isolation. 16% of our population has experienced 4 or more. So that means 5 kids in a class of 30. So 5 kids in my children's classroom is experiencing this. My kids might be a part of that. I was a part of that. So this is super prevalent. But kids are resilient. We hear that all the time. Kids are resilient, so we're good. They will grow up. Kids are resilient with the support of a caring adult. And I'm going to actually scrap that because parents care for their kids, but not all parents are able to provide that emotional support that their kids need. So what this research found, what the study found was that there were typical ways of development that they found was happening. So the kids were having behavior, learning, attention difficulties. I say kids, but this stemmed into adulthood. Emotional dysregulation, all those things we heard, decreased ability to cope with day-to-day stressors, an increase in physical and mental illness, so increase in anxiety and depression as a teenager, as an adult. People with 4 or more ACEs, there's a whole bunch of stats, I'm just touching base on this, where 12 times is likely to attempt suicide, 10 times to use injection drugs, and 7 times to use alcohol as a way of coping. And being careful with how I'm using these words because they really are a coping mechanism. When we are constantly triggered and our stress response system is in overdrive, we're all trying to find ways to cope. All right, so now that we know what trauma is and how prevalent it really is in our communities, I want to go back to that question of how have the experiences, for anybody, the 2 in 3 people, it's a lot of us who have experienced adversity in their childhood. How did they impact your parenting? And did you ever see it in that light? Now, I always wanted to be a parent. I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to have a baby to love and to hold. I couldn't wait to be that parent that I needed when I was a kid, to be able to provide for my kids emotionally and physically in the ways that my parents they weren't able to at that time. But then I had my kids. And those emotions that I had during those experiences, those negative experiences of sadness, of fear, of rage, of shame, of loneliness, came back like a flash that I just was not expecting. To be honest, they never went away. But when you're taking care of kids, these little human beings, and you're responsible, it becomes incredibly overwhelming when you haven't had time to process anything. We didn't talk about those experiences or those feelings because you don't. You're living through it. But then we don't talk about it as adults either. And we don't understand where those feelings come from. And I couldn't understand why the exterior of my life today looked so different from the exterior of my life as a child. Why my insides were reacting and being triggered by sounds, by sirens, by what people would say, by facial expressions, just as they did when I was a child. So why? So Dr. Linda May, she's a doctor at Yale University. What she says, the role of attachment between child and caregiver is stress regulation. We've heard that all day today. The role is stress regulation. So in that newborn baby, they're stressed, of course. They cry, they're hungry, they're wet, they're scared, they cry. Parent comes, parent loves on them. The baby knows again, I'm loved, I'm safe, I belong. And that happens over and over and over again. But in order for that attachment to happen, that caregiver has to be able to regulate their own stress while at the same time regulating the stress of their child. Now, if we think about trauma and what we defined it as, it's when that stress becomes toxic and it changes the way a child's brain develops and how they live and love and work and play and see the world. And so it becomes really hard because, as we've heard over and over again today, we react from that emotional place. And when you don't understand what those triggers are or why they are there, it is really hard to sit there and say, I can do this. So I know this sounds incredibly hopeless, but it is hopeful. It is super hopeful, because once I understood this study, and I didn't learn it through my, education as a registered nurse. I didn't learn it through any other capacity other than I knew I lived this life, and this is something I was very passionate about getting other people to understand. I could tell people, I grew up in a home where people I loved did and said and behaved in really horrible ways. But they also did and said and behaved in really beautiful ways. So I knew that every single person has good in them, and I believe that at the heart of all of this. But I couldn't see and understand why, when I had so much empathy and I could see that in other people, what was wrong with me. And so what this study did for me was, one, it validated my experiences and my feelings, because when they're not validated as children, we don't just become adults who are validated despite, billboards saying you shouldn't need validation. We need validation as children. We need it as adults. So it validated my feelings and my experiences. It reminded me that I'm not alone, despite feeling alone and misunderstood my entire life, let's say. And I'm not broken, because you feel that way, and that there is hope. And that's what this study and this information tells us, that it's never too late to make those changes. And for me, I needed this in order to say, okay, I experienced trauma. I'm not going to put that off. It is what it is. Okay, I have an overactive stress response system. Everything is triggering me, including my kids. And more than anything, it made me realize that all of this was inhibiting my ability to connect with my kids and to build those relationships that my kids needed in order for them to grow resilient, emotionally regulated, and be able to receive love from people and give love themselves. And that is such a good story. And so I just want to leave it on this. There's so much more I want to say, but I know, Connie, I want to praise your book and stuff. So I just want a few minutes for that. As parents, when we can better understand our own stories, because we don't talk about those hard places. We live them, we survive, and then we continue to live through them. But we can start healing, and we won't have to worry about being the parent we needed, because we'll be able to be patient and present enough to be the parent our own kids need us to be today. And that is